Hi everyone, this is Esther Martinez and we're back with another masterclass in the People Matters virtual learning series. Today's topic is on navigating total rewards in the new normal. Of course, a very critical topic in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's really impacted not only the here and now of the last few weeks, but also as we look forward. So joining us for this session, I have the privilege to welcome Puneet Swami. He's the senior partner and career business leader for the international region at Mercer. So welcome, Puneet. Very, very warm welcome to this session.
Thank you, Esther, and thank you, for inviting me for this session. I really look forward to having a very insightful discussion and sharing some of the key trends we've seen in the region, especially in these turbulent times. So look forward to the session.
Thank you. Thanks, Puneet. Thanks for taking time to putting this together for us this morning. So Puneet needs no introduction for many of you in the region. He brings over 20 years of consulting experience, providing advice and leading the local and multinational organization consulting across 25 countries in Asia Pacific, Middle East, and Africa. He's worked extensively in areas like talent management, HR transformation, rewards, variable pay design, and employee engagement, and talent assessment. So very excited to have you with us, Puneet, sharing some of those best practices, if I can call it, even though there are no best practices in this current context, but some insights that you have seen working with your clients in the region, and also some recommendations that you have for us. So the structure for today, we're going to have, as we always do, a couple of questions that we put together for you to help us reflect and get an idea about the composition of the audience. Then I'll request Puneet to take over the session, and he's prepared a deck for all of us. And as we always do, we will have some questions at the end. So feel free to use the chat on the right side. And if you're joining us from LinkedIn Live or YouTube Live, feel free to use whichever chat you have, because our team is compiling all the questions across channels. So let's start with the first question. If I invite you all to open a new window and go to menti.com, you will see it also on the screen. It's menti.com. And enter the code. The code for today is 795178. You can see it on the screen as well. I'm repeating the code for all of you. 795178. So the first question we've prepared for you is, in the view of the COVID-19 situation, is your organization reviewing the workforce plans for this year? First option is no change, everything remains the same. Second is we actually planning to hire more employees. So we're thinking of increasing our headcount. Third question is we cautious on hiring, but we are not cutting jobs during this period. Fourth, we're considering laying off employees. We don't know when, but that's in discussion. And the last question, we have already started our layoff process as we speak. So let's have a sense of the room. And again, I'm repeating the code. You need to go to menti.com. The code is 795178. Great. So Puneet, when you were putting this question for us and the answers, and I don't want to bias the group before we see this, what did you have in mind where the data has already started to come? So you can start giving me a sense of what is looking like for you.
Sure. And we've got some data, when we polled organizations across the APAC region, and like we've seen a couple of different trends, right? There's a growing consensus that organizations want to take care of their employees. So the sense of empathy, yes, it is turbulent times, but not everyone has started, exiting employees or severance or redundancies, but actually taking care of employees, which is very different from the previous crisis or pandemics. Right, in our previous experience, if you look at the 2009 financial crisis or even earlier the SARS crisis, what we saw was a huge amount of layoffs, severance, and I think there's a different understanding now that human capital or people are going to be a key resource and a differentiator as and when things start to recover. So people want to hold on to their top resources or top assets, and we've clearly seen that as a big differentiator this time.
Mm. So it doesn't surprise you to see big majority of everyone being cautious, but not cutting jobs.
Well, I'm glad to see that, at least if I can be very honest, because it kind of shows the the long focus or long-term focus, right? Which is, yes, we are in a difficult situation, maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, maybe slightly even more, right? But from a long-term perspective, what actions we take now speak about how the company is being considered by current employees, but also potential employees, right? And I think that has a big impact, and that long-term focus would really help organizations kind of differentiate themselves.
Wonderful, wonderful. So that's taking me to the second question, actually, because it's inviting us to reflect about, okay, what are some of the actions that we had to take, because we all had to take decisions during this time. If I can invite you to look, so the question is, what options has your organization considered or considering to save workforce related costs? The reality is that many industries, many organizations are under a tremendous pressure on cost at this moment as we speak. So what are some of the options that you have considered or you're considering? And if I can invite you all to choose maximum of three. So the first is about hiring freeze. Second is about pay reduction or benefits cut put together. Reduction in work hours, incentive payment deferred, furloughs, or none of the above. So choose only three, maximum of three. So we get a sense of some of the actions that you had to take or you're considering taking because of the cost related pressures. And we love to hear, as we get the data to come, how you have seen this being different from the other crises as well, Puneet.
Sure. See, again, as I said, the typical tendency has been around pay reductions, has been around short-term, and again, what you'll see is as the pandemic kind of lasts, right? There are three different horizons. So immediate reaction is, are my employees fine? How do we take care? 3 or 6 months later, we see a lot of organizations start saying, but we still need to optimize our costs. And hence, let's cut on marketing, let's cut on travel, let's get on all those discretionary spends around it. And then the third phase, where you probably start doing a strategic review of your workforce to say what skills do I require now, considering the new normal, and what's the size of my workforce, shape of my workforce. So that's what we've typically seen, depending on what time horizon we are in. And I think it'll be interesting to see, our participants currently, what time horizon are they looking at.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so here we have first one being hiring freeze, followed by incentive deferrals, and followed by pay reductions. Is this something you have seen personally, working with your clients in the region? Are you resonating with this?
So yes and no, and I'll tell you
Anything
why.
that surprises? Yeah.
So I think it is about timing, right? And I'll talk about that in the deck. But see, if you look at the salary increases, a lot of those salary increases timelines are January, March, April. Those are the most common months for salary increases. And by the time the pandemic really hit, a lot of companies had already implemented their salary increases. So yes, they might be doing hiring freezes, but I think the salary kind of increases were already implemented, which was different. And on the incentives, we've seen slightly different. We've seen, 7 out of 10 companies kind of actually continuing with their incentive plans, because they were also trying to support their employees, right? There's a lockdown, people can't go and sell, and there are a lot of those sales employees which are 70%, 80% variable. Now, if you don't support them, what about, how will they run their houses or families? So companies have been more empathetic around some of these, and actually what we've seen is that the incentive reviews have happened, but they haven't cut down on the incentive plans.
Yeah. Does it surprise you that reduction of work hours is actually probably one of the lowest? Is that a surprise?
No, because of two reasons. I think one, a lot of them are salaried employees, right? So for salaried employees, reduction of work hours it's not like that. You can work less number of hours in a day. Yes, you can probably tell them to work 3 days a week or 2 days a week, which is different. But I think the impact there hasn't been big enough for organizations to say, that'll help me, because people who are working full time are really required full time, and people who don't or who can't work are the ones they don't want. So it's very difficult to say you work half day and everyone works half day, for example.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Wonderful, wonderful. So I think this gives us a sense also of the composition of the group today, Puneet. So as you go through your deck, it also gives you a context of what are the listeners today going through in this crisis. So over to you, Puneet, and if we can have the deck, please, for Puneet ready.
Thank you, Esther. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar around navigating total rewards. Clearly, we open the year with a vision of excitement and what the next decade will bring. We made lots of leaps in technology, data, healthcare. Uh, but as we say, sometimes the best laid plans are also kind of put aside, and that's what's happened with the pandemic, which we've kind of seen across us. Uh, the threat of pandemic has mean that the business continuity has been challenged without an end date. We are still exploring on where the bottom of this pandemic would be, and how would we kind of emerge out of it, and what will be the strategies to work around that. Now, while companies are struggling on the economics of the pandemic, we are also seeing some shifts around some of the uh, timing of it, right? To say, is it going to last us 3 months? Is it going to last us 6 months? What kind of timings are we seeing on the pandemic, right? And everyone's been taking a guess. When we started seeing the peak around March, April, people thought 3 months, probably 6 months, very strong. And now, if you see, we're starting seeing more about 9 to 12 months. So clearly, a lot of discussions around what shape of the recovery will be, the time frames I spoke about, but also around what should we expect. One thing is clear: there's been a lot of fiscal and monetary stimulus, and there was a discussion around V-shaped recovery. I think with whatever economists are showcasing now, the V-shaped recovery looks highly unlikely. There's clearly extensive damage which has happened to corporates, households, all of that. Most markets in the region, the economies are way worse than what they experienced in either the global financial crisis of 2009 or the SARS or the Asian financial crisis. Uh, Believe it or not, for the first time in 60 years, we're looking at Asia having a negative GDP growth rate compared to that. India is looking at a negative GDP growth rate since the late 70s or early 80s. So clearly, the impact, as you would see from here, is huge on the world economies, and absolutely triggering a deep economic crisis. As we go to the next slide, we also looked at how business has been responding to some of these issues, and what are the top of the mind issues which organizations have kind of looked at. Clearly, as you would see from the data, nearly every organization seems to be doing some kind of change or transformation, right? A lot of that is around streamlining, around simplifying. Clearly, the driver of that is to cultivate more innovation, have more collaboration, explore new opportunities or new ways of doing things. Clearly, that also means that there are challenges, right? There are financing challenges, as well as lack of understanding on how do I transform, because I don't know what the end state is. So clearly, there is refocused attention, but organizations still don't know what will that future 6 months, 12 months look like. There's discussion to say we might never have 100% people back to work, right? Or offices, maybe 50%, maybe 30% are going to work from homes even in the longer future. Now, how do you transform your organization when you don't have those kind of data? So that's clearly one of the areas where we've seen kind of differences emerging. The second one has been around the simple thing around focus on redesign of the organization, right? And again, design change, as I said, is there. The issue, what remains, is that not only predicting the future is tough, but also with all the economic and political uncertainty, how do we do it? Last but not the least, there's been a lot of focus to say, yes, individuals have time. This time can be utilized for learning and development. Can we do more reskilling? Can we align to the future skills required? So there is a lot of efforts being made to reskill or upskill the employees at this point of time. And that investment will yield results as we get into the future. Let's go to the next slide. So, while we thought we will talk about what would be the key reward practices, how should organizations kind of move around, we also thought it will be critical for us to talk about what are some of the immediate reactions of the organizations on their comp and benefit policies, right? A couple of questions like we asked you, but that was our intention. And here is some of the results which Mercer did recently around, what were some of the common trends. And so let's start with the left of the slide deck. And what you'll see from the left slide deck is that, you know, what were organizations doing for employees who were not diagnosed, obviously, but also who were not able to work because of lack of commuting or because of having to stay at home notices or leave of absence and all that. As I mentioned earlier, what we are seeing is a much more broader view from the organizations. Nearly half of the organizations still continue to pay those employees full time. One fourth of the organizations saw that this was not even an applicable category to them. And then we do see pockets of companies which have either reduced pay, which are either deducting leave of the employees against that, or unpaid leave factors around it. But the numbers there are about more or in the range of about 10 to 15%. Um, on the on the right hand side of the slide, what you will see is what about employees who just can't work, right? Let's say a receptionist, let's say office boy, a factory worker who had to operate a machine. Now, because of business closures, they can't work from home. So, what have companies done around these kind of jobs or professions? Again, we see, a longer, nearly half of the organization saying we're still continuing with pay for these employees. But now you see start, the increase in numbers around reduced pays, cut in pay, or unpaid leave or leave of absence being added here, and the numbers have started to go up where you see about, two or three out of 10 organizations implementing some kind of clawbacks or returns. So you go to the next slide. What we also did, and that was one of the points I was trying to mention earlier, right? To say, what happens to the merit salary increases for 2020. As I mentioned, January, March, April are the three most common months for salary increases in the region. And what we saw here clearly was that by the time the pandemic really started hitting a lot of regions, outside of China, it was March when the lockdown started. In fact, mid March when the lockdown started, and a lot of companies had already made decisions, implemented increases for the Jan, March, and April ones. And that's why if you see about 6 to 7 out of 10 companies are saying that they've already either effected the increase or are not making any changes there. But you still see, and if you look at the top three, the orange, the purple, and the blue bars, that tells you about the kind of companies which are looking at, or sorry, the countries which are looking at reductions. Now it could be delays, it could be freezes, or it could simply be reduction. And we are seeing again about 25 to 35%, which means nearly two or three out of the 10 organizations are actually implementing reductions in some of these proposed salary increases as well. Uh, there was a question around incentives, and what are companies doing around it. As I mentioned earlier, what we have seen is that clearly a lot of organizations are trying to align their incentives to the new normal. The problem here is we don't know what that would be, but there's a revision of goal setting, right? The targets which were set beginning of the year don't seem possible. There's been lockdowns continuing still in the countries, so revision of targets, which means revision of incentive plans, primarily has been driven by about, again, 25 to 40% of the organizations across the region. Different countries have shown it differently. But if you see more than half of the organizations are still, not making any changes, they still want to figure out what does it actually mean. Will we only have online sales, or will we have a lot more of in-person face-to-face sales or door-to-door sales, which were pretty common before the pandemic hit, and hence no changes around from that perspective. uh, Executive compensation also has been an important topic, and I think there's been a lot of news around what are the pay cuts which are the top executives have been doing, and there've been numbers around 20%, 30% pay cuts at the senior levels, temporary even though, but around that. Our data shows again similar, which is about 20% odd companies across industries have implemented some kind of pay alignment for their executives. clearly industries which were hard impacted: automotive, retail, hospitality, services, logistics have been more aggressive, or percentage of companies there has been much more than the companies in some of the other sectors. So again, sector-wise, huge differentiation, but about 20 to 30% of companies have implemented some form of relook at exec compensation, even though it's for short term. Uh, there's been a lot of discussion around what about the frontline employees, right? And what are companies doing around these frontline employees? Are they providing them with additional benefits or additional packages of making them come to work? Some of the bank branches have been open, customer call service centers, even some of the essential services which have to had to open in this. And again, what you would see here is that there is a strong preference to provide additional allowances, especially if they've been asking individuals to come in, on the lack of local transportation or public transportation, on how do they arrange for somehow their own cars or taxis or private hires around that, and kind of paying for allowances or paying for payments for those ones. Again, have some of the key criteria, but again, nearly 4 or 5 out of 10 companies have been providing monetary support, additional monetary support, if I can say that, for their frontline employees. Um, as we go through the pandemic, right, it's going to be very critical on which phase of the pandemic are we, depending on what country, what industry we are in, to talk about what are we going to do. And let me talk about three phases, right? Let's start with the first one, which was pandemic started to peak. Government started lockdown. Everyone was asked to go by work from home, and the first thing companies looked at was that, okay, can my employees work from home, and how do I ensure that I protect pay for my employees in the short run, hoping it'll be over in the next 2 months, 3 months around it, right? And as the pandemic continued to spread, even get more and more in size, we saw some of the cost containment measures being implemented. Cutting off marketing spends, cutting off discretionary expenses, cutting off travel. A lot of those expenses was kind of being cut out in that, and that was the second response, right? Um, and that was the immediate thing. Now there are other countries, or there are countries which are now returning to work. China's already returned, but we're seeing a lot of European countries coming back, a lot of Southeast Asian countries which are coming back, and hence what we are seeing when that limited return to work is happening, that obviously that cost containment measures are in place, but companies are also now starting to think more and say, do I really need 100-seater office, right? Can I still have, even after things get better, 30% or 40% of my people working from home, which means there'll be a different cost containment measure around it. Do I really need to have all direct sales or face-to-face sales, or can I increase my e-commerce or online sales, which happened when the pandemic was there, for example? And then as we get into the reinvent stage, this is when the pandemic is probably settled down, and probably being, if not eliminated, being reduced to a major extent, that the new normal starts to emerge, and then companies start thinking through, saying, if this is the new normal, what's the size and the shape of the workforce I'll require? And all during these three stages, right, there are different impacts on compensation, right? When you're protecting pay, to having cost containment in terms of reducing discretionary expenses, to obviously to say what should be my pay package look like, what should my incentive plan look like in the new normal. um, and that's a how organizations should think through their rewards policies, and navigate the pandemic around that. Let's also start, even though the pandemic has made some short-term decisions, and I spoke about that, right, around increases, around incentives, around executive compensation, and how do we respond. uh, Parallelly, there was already a lot of uh, kind of forces on play, which were making us rethink our whole rewards proposition and how we should be rewarding employees. And as we look at the drivers of what was creating that, right, we look at three key areas which were already creating this, but it has kind of even fast forwarded it with the pandemic. One, there's always been discussion in the last 3 to 4 years around workforce of the future, future skills, future work, and how do we get individuals ready for it. But there's also been a big discussion around to say, in the future, uh, guess what? There won't be jobs won't be the main or basic criteria for organizing work, right? A lot of the work will be around skills, and it will be the combination of skills which will determine how do we pay employees. So a lot or a big shift, and I'll talk about that in the future slide, but a big shift from position based or job based pay to skill based pay, right? And that's been created. The second has been around, obviously, to say, if all of these changes are happening, how do I create a delivery model which helps me to be efficient, right? Do I organize by functions? Do I organize by levels? What would be that area which will help me kind of organize the right way to deliver the right thing, and give more autonomy, less bureaucracy around it. And the whole network delivery model has been becoming way more important, right? Which is talking about how there'll be leaner structures. There will be less reliance to say, here is my manager, and work with my manager the whole year to say, I belong to a certain skill cluster. I have a manager of the skill cluster, but my skills are utilized across different projects. And that, again, all of this, if you link it to rewards, has an important point of how we will reward these employees, right? The second one, and there's been a lot of focus around it, especially with the pandemic, has been around employee sensing. How are my employees feeling? What can I do for them? What are the challenges they're facing? While from a short-term pandemic perspective, yes, that has been important. But even from a longer-term perspective, right? Employees have been very clear around, the balance between work life balance, right? What the importance of quality of life. I rather work 4 days a week and have a 3 day off rather than 4 day or 5 day working, for example. So the whole expectations of an employee on the employment relationship have been changing. Employees have also been saying that reward me not for individual performance but more broader performance. And this aligns to what's changing, right? Now they're working in a network model. Now they're working with 5 different project teams. Their contribution is just one part of the project success, but it's not that they control the overall success. So how do you then reward me for my individual performance, but rather reward me for the team performance? Last but not the least is, what kind of rewards do I want, right? Which is the whole era of personalization, individual preferences, um, around what will it look like in terms of that era, to say, my lifestyle is very different from a different person's lifestyle. My generation is very different from this, so hence my expectations of what rewards should be very different. And that has clearly made organizations rethink their whole reward processes, right? Last but not the least has been the whole impact which technology, software tools, artificial intelligence has on HR, right? Uh, if you look at a typical hiring process to firing process, everything has technology now. We have video interviews now. We have video analysis of candidates being done on how they responded and what could that mean. For example, onboarding is online rather than face to face, right? You're assessing individuals online. So AI automation has impacted a lot of these decisions. And then from a rewards perspective, what that means is that we've been able to automate pay structure design. We automate our annual salary increase processes. No longer do we need to create manually compare ratios, comparisons, pay proposals. All those are being automatically created based on a kind of a algorithm which has been programmed. So a lot of this changes are having a direct impact in the world of rewards. Now, this is very interesting, right? We keep, at least 20 25 years back when I started my career, the whole discussion was about how rewards was an intrinsic motivational tool, and higher the rewards, higher the motivation of the employee was. And let's look at what are we seeing now. We kind of seem to be stuck somewhere in the middle with all that discussion to say, is it really a motivation tool which is inspiring performance, right? Many companies in mature markets have relied on modest salary increases, clearly, to reward performance or align with this. Our budgets have been spread too thin. We've given our top performers, let's say 5%, and given an average performance 4%. So Do I really want to work so hard for 1% increase, for example, kind of stuff. Um, and what are we saying, right? And maybe things have changed with the pandemic, but before that we were talking about, oh, you had a great year, we have been able to do way more, the company results have been great, which employees are seeing on all the kind of published sources or all the stock market things. And then when it comes to salary increases, you say, oh, but we only got a salary increase budget of 3% or 4%, especially in the matured or emerged economies, right? So clearly it no longer remains that motivational tool, is what my point is, the way we had I kind of planned for. The second area around that is around, what about HR, right? Clearly, there is a strong pressure to say we need to be continuously evolving as an HR organization. The business is putting a lot of pressure to say, HR is the one who needs to be helping with the budgets, and you need to get me the right budgets approved from your global region, whatever headquarters it is. And at the same time, there's a discussion on compliance, pay equity, transparency. So we need to work around all of that. And as I said, the budgets we get are way different from what the business or the employees are expecting as it. But the blame game comes to HR, right? To say, oh, we wanted a higher budget, but HR never got us that budget, or HR never got that approval through. I had always put you on a much higher increase. So somehow, HR is stuck in the middle in this whole process between global and what employees' expectations are. Again, saying how whether it can make a difference or not. So uh, as we start moving on, from the current scenarios to the next scenarios, what we need to bear in mind is we just can't throw the old and welcome the new ones, right? We can't simply say, oh yeah, we will now be agile, we will review our structures every 3 months, we'll have skill based pay, we're going to have premiums around it, uh, and we're going to have, our managers be more responsible for it. Clearly companies are moving out from that period of centralization. There is more empowerment being given lower down in the organization. There is delegation of responsibilities, but I think we need to balance that agility, empowerment with what is considered to be fair or transparent, right? We can say empowered and we can make our managers empowered, but guess what? It'll create unseemingly biases, right? To say the manager was empowered, but they kind of made decisions which made certain employees get more than the others, and that's not fair, right? I thought we were being very balanced around it. So there's a risk of fairness and transparency increases as we review rewards more and more, as we try to link it to market-based premiums, as we try to link it to skill-based premiums, and the empowerment of managers who could probably have own inherent biases, which will kind of show up even more. So I think we need to balance that, even though we need to do less centralization around it. Uh, as we get into that new normal, right? There are three things which we are recommending every organization to adopt. As you get into that new normal, as you start reinventing, the third phase I spoke about, the reinvent one, from a reinventing perspective is around. First one is around agility, right? Agile rewards is all about organizations themselves, your businesses, yourself are continuously evolving, right? Either you're introducing new technology, or you're introducing automation, or the skill, or the profile of the people, or how the people are working seems to be changing. And if all of that is happening, how do you make sure your rewards are continuously evolving, right? If you're changing from being face-to-face sales to online sales, how does your reward programs or incentive programs change around it? If you're now bringing in, not full-time employees but gig workers, contractors, freelancers, what about pay for them, right? How are you going to differentiate them? Most of us don't even consider them as full-time employees. So how are we going to reward them differently? What about their benefits? What about their pension or social security, or some of the other items around it? So clearly, we need to rethink the whole process around agility and link it to rewards continuously evolving with that. The second one is around skill-based pay, right? And as I said, the biggest driver of this is the whole move away from jobs into skills, which is organizations in the future or in the near future might not even have fixed jobs, right? You could have a job So, for example, you might not have a job to say, I'm a financial analyst, I'm a risk analyst, I'm an operation analyst, or I'm a MIS analyst, because these are separate jobs. But the skill I have is to analyze and report data, and I could apply that skill into any of the functions I mentioned, right? So I'm being paid for that skill rather than the five different jobs I mentioned earlier. And clearly, I think that's going to be a big difference on how we look at rewards again. Last but not the least is the whole demand from employees about a consumer grade experience, and how they want to look at choices being available to them based on their lifestyle, based on their persona, and based on generation, a lot of different factors. And how are organizations able to do it, and how are they able to integrate technology with it, because that's the only way to make this a cost effective way. So let's explore a little deeper around, how do we make that happen. Let's start with agile rewards. As I said, agility is all about making continuous changes or improvements to our processes, to our delivery models, where each change doesn't look like a new step, right? It's not that every 3 months organization makes a change, and employees are saying, oh, I don't think my organization knows what is happening here. They keep on upgrading, they keep on changing the structure. So agility is all about being close to the customers, understanding the customers' needs, and making changes. It also means that you need to be collaborating with different parts of the organization, because you're only the front end of the organization. And how do you kind of keep integrating in that change, is going to be critical. Uh, and as we start to do that, I think what is going to be very important is that we might not have annual peer reviews. Agility is all going to be about as and when, right? If 3 months, 6 months, whatever is required, whenever we make a change into our process, we need to change our rewards policies. It also means that your traditional system of annual pay review, annual increase, all of that will not work. Let's move to the next one around skill-based pay. And as I said, the skill-based pay clearly has three areas. One, that no longer jobs will be the organizing factor, but it will be skills. Second, skills doesn't mean technical skills only. Like, skills means it's a combination of cognitive and behavioral skills. So let's take a data scientist as an example. Data scientists need technical skills around problem solving, data modeling, statistical analysis, but they also need skills around communication. They also need skills around, listening, or understanding of the problem. So a combination of this is what will in the future be able to kind of link people to their pay. And it's a dynamic model, right? Because as you keep getting more and more skills, your pay levels keep changing. Now, this is very, counterintuitive to what you see from a traditional concept of pay for performance, which was, higher I perform, higher do I get it. The skill-based pay says if you acquire higher skills, if you acquire newer skills, you get paid for that. Yes, if your performance is high, you get higher bonuses, but not salary increase. So your salary increase is determined by what new did you learn, whereas your bonus is learned with how you perform. So that's a model we need to bear in mind as we do that. The last one on personalization, as I said, is all about the need for employees to have experience which is aligned to their requirements. A lot of organizations have moved to say, oh, we have, multi generation pay levels. Uh, we can talk about, Gen X requires this, Gen Y requires that, millennial generation requires that. That's fine, but what if I have three millennials who all have very different lifestyles? One wants to invest in his future, and training and learning and development is very important. The other one wants to drive the best car and the best gym and the best health club membership, and requires a very different set of rewards. So how do we look at lifestyles? How do we look at personas, and then create rewards for employees is going to be critical. And as I said, the most important thing to do that, especially if you have 5,000, 10,000 employees, is the use of technology. And the next slide will show you an example of, a technology tool we've seen being used in the market a lot, where employees at the press of a button can look at all of their rewards. It's not only about compensation benefits. How does it compare? Do I have flexible choices? Can I choose from a list, or a drop down to say I want to change my reward preferences middle of the year? And how do I communicate around that? All of that can be done through technology. This is an example of a Darwin, which is a technology tool, as an example which could be used. Now let's quickly, move on, and I do want to kind of leave some time around for question and answers. But very quickly, you know, I spoke about transparency, I spoke about agility, but as I said, the the biggest risk we face when we kind of start doing, every quarter a review to say, have you acquired a new skill? Should I pay you higher? Have you now worked in a different team? Has your results been very different? Is around employee morale itself, right? Some employees who are underpaid might feel, how do I change? Or organization is not being fair for to me, right? Transparency has its own problems because you're not being able to move everyone at one go because your budgets are limited. So how do you manage that as well? From a manager perspective, it could be treated as a bias, right? As I said, there could be misalignment on how managers want to reward who they feel are high performers compared to what the data says to say, oh, these four people have acquired great skills. We want to increase their base salary, and the managers might feel, but these are my top performers. I want to pay them more. And how do you differentiate between bonus and base salary increases around it? Last but not the least, how do you get hold of all the data from an HR perspective, right? This is a dynamic pricing, ever evolving data. How do I make sure that I have all the right data to make those agile rewards, to have those skill based compensation data, which might still not be available in a lot of those markets? And how do I govern then to say that is it 3 months? Is it every time a person acquires a new skill? How will I manage that? Let's move on. Uh, So clearly, we're looking at two things, and I spoke about this already earlier, which is how the whole point about automation, artificial intelligence, algorithms are going to create our reward function to automate a lot of these things, right? So you don't have to necessarily create it. But then there's also a balance on trust here, right? How do we feel that our employees are trusting on those algorithms? They feel that the right structures have been driven. They feel that the organization has done the right benchmarks on the skill which was required around it. So clearly, I think it's going to be a balance of these two, which is going to be very critical as we start moving into that, the three key areas from a future rewards perspective. I'm just mindful of time, and can we just move on and let's skip the next 2 3 slides, but let's move on. Yeah, let's move on. One more slide. One more. Yeah. So again, we'll share a copy of the deck with you, but I just want to make sure I did cover the last part, which is I think is very critical, which is around clearly, this pandemic has a very strong defining moment. We've got lots of employees in our organizations which have never seen the pandemic. They were probably not even working when the 2009 financial crisis happened. And how we respond, how do we around employee engagement, productivity, our commitments to them, will create a long lasting image of the company's brand to them. And I think we need to be very careful around how we do that. We kind of looked at Mercer, we did a survey around employees across APAC and said what were employees concerned with and what was on their mind. Clearly, they were pretty pleased with the amount of communication and confidence in the organization. Flexible working arrangement was on top of their mind, and how do they balance their work and their personal life, especially working from home, was considered to be very critical as some of the key points. And as we go forward, our recommendation to each one of you would be that the focus on communication, and if you go to the next slide, the focus on communication is going to be very critical. I think as organization, as leaders, we need to be regularly being in touch with employees who are all at different places, are not kind of coming together. We've seen a lot more companies setting up regular calls, whether they're weekly check-ins, bi-weekly check-ins, daily check-ins, depending on the role of the work. But that clearly is a very strong message you want to leave, which is that make sure you are reaching out to your team, make sure you're reducing that anxiety, and also have a very clear response to the specific questions around the economics of the organization which they might have. As we go to the next slide, the other area which is going to be very critical, on the next slide, please, is around health issues, and I'm going to talk about mental and financial wellness, but very critical for organizations to look at the health issues, right? There are three key areas. One around digital health, because the hospitals and doctors are closed, around telemedicine, and ensure you have enough tie-ups, ensure that you have enough reach out and are educating employees on how they can reach out. Second around is, what about your benefits coverage itself? COVID-19 kind of showed us that there were lots of gaps in our benefit coverages to what an organization should have ideally held. So it's very important for us to kind of relook at that and make sure that we've kind of revamped our benefit coverages. And this includes not only full-time employees, but our freelancers, contractors as well. I did cover let's move to the next slide. I did cover um, on flexible working arrangements. Let's move on. Just 30 seconds on the last slide around how do we make sure we keep our employees engaged and productive. And my recommendation here would be that you really need to have strong collaboration and technology tools. So ensure that we have employees are able to reach out not only one-on-one but across forums. They kind of feel the same discussions are open online. And second, if we are able to create or understand their holistic needs, someone might be a single parent who cannot able to work in the morning when they take care of their kids. So be more flexible around their understanding around the holistic needs of our employees working from home rather than individually. So I'm just going to stop here. I know there are lots of questions around that. Sorry, we need to just kind of rush it up in the end. As Esther would say, I can keep going on and on with the topic, but over to you, Esther.
Thank you. Thanks, Puneet. And the good news is we had a lot of questions. The second good news is that you actually answer a lot of them as you were going through your presentation. So a lot of those questions that came maybe 15 to 20 minutes before got kind of answered. What I'm going to invite you to do is I'm going to request you to take a little bit of time, and if you could go to the LinkedIn Live and interact with everyone who was there asking questions. So you can take a little bit of your time and answer those questions as well on the chat. That will be great. So I'm going to choose two questions, which I think could be meaningful. One is on the return phase. There are a lot of questions on that, but I'm going to choose only one. And then one on the reimagine work, please. The only thing I'm going to request you is to be little crisp on your answers, because we have already exceeded time, but I think it's still worth everyone time to spend a couple of more minutes. So the question on the return phase is on how do we manage that morale? How do we help people in our organization to be more engaged when there is a lot of probably additional workload, there is a lot of additional tension, as you mentioned, and there is also a cash pressure that all of us are going through. So is there any innovative ways that you have seen your customers using to be able to engage, at the same time reduce the financial burden of employees, and at the same time keep the financial burden of the organization as well in mind?
So clearly, I think keeping employees mentally, resilient and looking after the financial well-being of employees is going to be very critical. Some of the best practices we've seen there is one around keeping the teams connected. It makes people feel that I'm not alone in this. I'm not the only one going through this. There's when you keep talking to your team members on a regular basis, that happens. Second is communicate information about how the company is doing. How we are, so people are clear rather than making guesses around it. And third, it might be stigma in certain countries, but providing mental health support, right? There are a lot of counselors, there are a lot of employee assistance programs, which organizations should be considering. We've also seen some organizations actually hire financial wellness consultants to give kind of seminars or webinars like this to the employees to say, what can you do? Should you be exiting your investments? Should you be holding on to them? How do you get short-term cash available? All of that. So I think those are some of the key areas organizations could look at as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And the last question, Puneet, as a closing, there was a big question on, what are the things that will stay in the maybe in the long run, 5 years from today, and you covered some of it when you were refining the future of work. But one advice for all of us in this call of one thing that we should start doing as HR professionals very differently to prepare for the reimagine work phase, and one thing that we should stop doing, one thing to start, one thing to stop, as we close this session today.
Sure. I think choosing one out of the many is going to be very critical. But I think what we need to start doing is to be clear around what the role machines will play. So automation, AI, will play from a rewards or from an HR perspective, right? To say, I don't need to interview candidates. I'm having a video interview which is being assessed there. I don't need to create a salary structure. So be very clear on what role will I play, which will add value to that future organization compared to what I have been doing. And then from a stop doing perspective, I think it is around, we probably need to be more open on challenging on how things have been done previously, right? The whole point always comes to say, oh, in our organization things have always been done like this, and you stop doing that and start challenging that is going to be very critical.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks, Puneet. And we are really run out of time right now. And thank you so much for taking your time preparing this deck for us, for your insights, your experience, and as always, your very candid answers. So thank you very much, Puneet, for joining us this
Thank
morning.
you. Thank you for having me, and I hope everyone liked this. I'll try and answer some of the other questions later on as well. But thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Puneet. Puneet Swami, Senior Partner, Career Business Leader, International Region at Mercer. Thank you. Thank you once again. So I'm very excited to close this session today. We had a huge participation, and of course, the topic of rewards is always very close to the business. So we've always seen tremendous engagement with this topic. So I'm very, very happy that it was meaningful to each one of you. I'm also excited to share with you that we're going to be seeing you once again very soon on 19th of June at the People Matters Employee Experience Conference. And it's our endeavor to put employee experience at the center, and we'll be covering many areas. And I invite you all to go to the People Matters EX conference website to see the agenda. And we will see you all there. And this concludes today's session. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening ahead, a wonderful Friday, and a great weekend.
Thank you all.